My name's Adam Rorris. I'm an education economist. I've worked with the Australian Education Union, I've worked with governments in Australia, both state and national, and I've worked with UN agencies like UNICEF and UNESCO, as well as the World Bank. I've been commissioned by the AEU to prepare a study looking at school funding in Australia as we move from 2016 into the future. I think the first thing that we need to say is that the inequitable distribution of funds that we see and we can observe in Australian schooling, that is, that too many of the wealthier schools in fact have more money than the poorer schools, there's nothing actually natural, there is nothing normal about that, and it's not something that you see replicated across the world. Indeed, I don't think it's a stretch to say that when it comes to school funding, the way that Australia distributes its funds positions it as an outlier within the global system of school funding. We can do better. The cost of this inequitable distribution is that we also have a very inequitable distribution of learning outcomes across the school population. We need to do better, not just from a point of view of social justice, big and important as that is, but this report makes very clear this country needs to do better in the way it distributes its funds if it wants to have a more robust, a more competitive and a more innovative economy that is able to position and deliver the kind of services that we would expect into our old age and which future generations deserve in order to be able to live in this country, be able to protect this country, its environment, its people, and the kind of lifestyle that we all would want to see in the future. I think we've known for a long time that Australia's been inequitable in terms of its learning outcomes. The first part of my study was to look at the size of those inequities and how they were distributed. And the results were quite startling. My analysis showed that the children of the unemployed are 10 times more likely not to meet the NAPLAN minimum benchmarks in reading and mathematics. We show that children of blue-collar workers, of service workers like salespeople, their children, 10% of them are not meeting those benchmarks, compared to, say, for example, 1.2% of senior managers. The Indigenous problem in terms of learning outcomes for children is very well known, with approximately 25% of Indigenous children failing to meet those benchmarks. In other words, we have an education system, a schooling system, that is woefully inadequate at the moment for dealing with the needs and meeting the needs of some of the most disadvantaged communities and children that we have. The study that I did for the AEU really looked at two aspects of the economic costs and benefits of the school system in Australia. The first part was to look at the direct financial costs to the Australian government and state governments as well as Commonwealth government of an education system and a school system that is failing to meet the needs, the minimum needs of children in Australia. The second part of the study looked at the economic opportunities that were foregone through a failure to educate children, to all children, to a sufficient level and an adequate level for them to be able to participate productively within the economy, as well as being good citizens and active citizens within society in general. The study looks at the direct costs to the Australian economy of not meeting the schooling needs of all children. And we were able to cost some, but some were frankly just too difficult to be able to manage in such a short time. And yet we know they are very important. For example, we know from the experience in many other countries where these things have been costed that the health costs associated with all children not meeting having their needs met from schooling are very high. This reflects itself in inability, for example, to use medicines properly, or not being able to access services at a right time, or knowing that they exist in fact. It also reflects itself, the costs also reflect themselves in terms of the justice system. Incarceration rates for children that have dropped out, for example, are much higher than any other group. And these costs, we know, are very, very high, and they will be borne by society as a whole, and they'll be paid for by governments. But we were not able to cost these. What we were able to cost was the cost flowing from increased unemployment benefits that would need to be paid to unemployed, as well as foregone tax revenues that are generated because a greater proportion of the children that do not complete school, for example, do not find meaningful work. Our costing found that there would be approximately $60 billion in additional unemployment benefits paid until the year 2070, and there would be approximately $12 billion in foregone tax revenues. That amounts to, it translates to an average of $1.3 billion a year on average that the Australian government would have to be paying out in extra money every year because it had failed, in fact, simply to keep children into year 12. And this was a key finding of the report and highlights, in a conservative, I must say, in a very conservative estimate of what these additional costs. In fact, they would be quite higher. But conservatively, we could say it would be a minimum of $1.3 billion just only in foregone tax revenues and unemployment benefits. The second part of the report looked at the economic opportunities that are foregone by the Australian economy as a result of having the current percentage of students not meeting the minimum learning benchmarks as identified by the International PISA study. For this, we looked at an OECD commissioned study which had generated estimates not just for Australia but indeed for all the OECD countries plus an additional set of countries. They based their estimates on a very rigorous and robust econometric calculation that looked at the impact of improved education, the historical impact of improved education across the world, and they applied these estimates to generate forward estimates for what the likely benefits would be to a country like Australia or a country like the USA from having all its children meet the minimum benchmarks. In Australia's case, they found that Australia would be $2.2 trillion richer in total, in sum, by 2095 if in fact they were able to have all their children meet these minimum benchmarks. What does that mean? It means on average, every single year, Australia would generate $27 billion of additional economic growth, economic product, if it was able to have all its children meet these minimum benchmarks. So these are quite astounding figures, but they are real. They're not pulled out of the air. They have been generated by looking at what has been achieved in the past by countries that have managed to improve their education and the kind of growth it's generated for them. And when we project that into the future, that indeed is what is at stake for this country and its people. I think the Gonski review process generated the most sophisticated analysis of what is required by this country to actually move forward. It's a very simple formula, but it's been proven to be effective in other countries. It's called needs-based funding. The greater the need of a school and a community, quite simply, the greater amount of resources that should flow to that school and to that community. Why? Simply because to deliver more equitable outcomes and to deliver the kind of learning and the kind of schooling that every child surely deserves.